So thank you all for coming. I know you probably have more romantic things to be doing with your Valentine's Day morning, but thanks for being here, and hopefully you got some candy hearts. So yeah, Celie just explained that really well when she told me the theme, that this month's theme was rebel, and then sort of revealed the whole backstory that she'd wanted it to be dissent. I realized that that's sort of exactly what I wanted to talk about. That these two very closely related terms have come to have somewhat different meanings in the world of culture and cultural production. And I wanted to talk about them in the context of magazines, which is not just a part of what I do, but one of the things that I'm most in love with and passionate about. So I'm going to talk both about the work I do and magazines in general, but also pose a bunch of questions about how we think about rebellion and dissent in the context of print. So I'm the editorial and creative director of Bitch Media and one of its co-founders. I'm assuming at least some of you are here because you're Bitch readers. But if you're not familiar with what we do, I will tell you a little bit about it. This is our mission statement: to provide and encourage and engage thoughtful feminist response to mainstream media and popular culture. We're a nonprofit that started out in the San Francisco Bay Area about 18 years ago by publishing the magazine Bitch: Feminist Response to Pop Culture. And we were in the San Francisco Bay Area for a little more than 10 years, and then around 8 years ago we moved to Portland, where we really feel like we've found a home, and we really feel like this is our place. And since then we've expanded our work. We publish a quarterly magazine still. We also have a website that's updated daily. We do a bi-weekly podcast called Popaganda. And we recently launched a campus program where we work with professors and students to bring bitch materials into the classroom and bring speakers to campuses. So I describe myself as a pop culture holic, which is definitely true, but more specifically, if pop culture were like a university discipline, my concentration would be in magazines, because that's the thing that I've always loved. I was cleaning out my mother's apartment a few years ago, and I found this big manila envelope full of zines that I had done as a kid. And this is one that's basically drawings of candy, and my interests actually haven't changed that much. I would still totally do this. And later I started drawing comics and self-publishing comics. But magazines were my ongoing fascination, and they still are. And I'm particularly interested in the evolution of magazines, you know, how they change and they morph over their lifespans. I grew up in New York City, and one of the first magazines I really got interested in was Details, which started as a zine in 1982 before it was bought by Condé Nast in the 1980s and became the sort of standard issue men's magazine it is today, with articles about, you know, suits and running shoes and the best cuts of meat and stuff like that. But when it started, it was a chronicle of downtown New York nightlife and art and subcultures, and it was black and white. It had really arty photos. Its gossip column items were like about drag queens instead of about celebrities, and it was really great. One of the other magazines I got obsessed with around this time was Spy magazine, which was also very New York centric, but was more about the world of media. And if you've ever seen like a separated at birth photo gag, that's something that Spy pioneered. And really any sort of, you know, sort of snarky little listicle or pop culture flowchart or infographic that you see now, it owes something of a debt to Spy. it was really great. It was highbrow, it was lowbrow. It really cemented my feeling that magazines were this kind of magical fusion of art and humor and opinion and intellect. And it sort of also offered the sense that the right magazine was a place where you as a creator could express yourself in a way that was completely unique to that medium, in a way that you wouldn't be able to do in, you know, a novel or an essay or maybe, you know, a more traditionally literary form. And it was art that was also a product, and that was meant to be a product. And that brings us to our first rebellion question: can a project be a product? So the third magazine that kind of changed my life was one that I actually got to work at, and that was Sassy magazine, which was the first teen magazine to sort of be an alternative to Young Miss and 17 and all those. Just to give you a sense of context, in the late 1980s when it launched, when Sassy launched, 17 magazine was still publishing ads for like engagement rings and hope chests. It was very much focused on, you know, making teen girls into perfect young ladies. So Sassy was really a true alternative to that mindset, because it sort of focused on what happens when you don't conform, what happens when you encourage teen girls to embrace their differences. And it had a really specific voice. Historically, teen magazines had spoken to girls with this sort of parental voice of authority, and Sassy's voice came from a core group of writers and editors who were not only fairly young themselves, but who were very upfront about the fact that they were still also figuring out things like friendship and popularity and sex and power. And so Sassy, in that way, became dissent and rebellion kind of rolled together, in the sense that it was very earnest in championing individuality and political engagement, but it also very consciously packaged the alternative girl as a type. The alternative girl, you know, wore black combat boots and listened to Sonic Youth and used natural deodorant. And in putting that forth, Sassy created as much a type of girl as 17 or Young Miss created. And what interning at Sassy made me realize was that, you know, from an economic perspective, you could position yourself as an alternative, but if you're still dependent on the traditional revenue streams of magazines, that's going to complicate things. That's going to complicate your ability to be a true alternative. One of the main things I did as an intern there was send faxes between Sassy's parent company and its advertisers, because Sassy was always being boycotted by places like the American Family Association and Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority and all these other conservative organizations who were outraged at the way they wrote about things like sexuality and gay teens and things like that. So it had all these angry mothers writing letters to like TAM brands being like, do not advertise Tampax in this godforsaken magazine full of sin. So that was going on, and that was an ongoing struggle, and that characterized Sassy's whole lifespan. They were always treading water until eventually they couldn't anymore. And in the late 1990s, actually in the mid-1990s, they were bought by this other publishing company, which sort of tried to retain the magazine's cool factor while defaulting to the usual teen girl tropes of like prom and dieting. And it was pretty mortifying to witness. It was like, if you've ever seen Mean Girls, it was like the cool mom played by Amy Poehler. And we were like, you're not a cool mom, Sassy. It's not. Yeah, so that's how I found out how the sausage gets made, basically at mainstream magazines, and it was pretty disheartening. But it taught me that publishing that really, truly does go against the grain was much more subversive than I thought, and rarer precisely because it was such an uphill battle. But the thing about these three magazines, Detail, Spy, and Sassy, that I didn't necessarily have the language for at the time I was involved with them, is that they really wrote against the culture while retaining the form of a product of that culture. And when my co-founders and I started Bitch, that's exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to take the formal conventions of a magazine, you know, the short, like snacky front of book bits and the features well and the standalone back page. And and use that in the service of something that was more on the fringe, in this case, feminist activism. Rebellion question number 2, who defines selling out? So we started Bitch as a zine. We printed a couple of hundred copies at a copy shop and hand stapled them together. And in our minds, it was a zine only situationally, in the sense that we always had the dream that it would become a magazine, in like a regular magazine size and with an office and a staff and a regular production schedule. Bitch was founded just as zines were kind of having a moment in American culture. It was this sort of post-grunge time when alternative culture and subcultures were kind of on the mainstream radar. So like the New York Times was writing about zines, and Newsweek was calling up, creators and being like, tell me about your little zine, because they didn't know how to pronounce it. In the summer after our first 2 issues came out, we participated in the San Francisco leg of this thing called the Kill Zinesters Tour, in which established zine publishers toured the United States in this tricked out RV and set up like little mini festivals in different cities. And the tour was partially sponsored by Urban Outfitters and Epitaph Records and a couple of other companies. And this led to a lot of chatter within the zine community about whether this constituted selling out. And selling out was one of those concepts that no one ever really defined, but because of zines having roots in punk rock, it was always this very loaded term that you just didn't want to deal with. Using the phrase was like a way to discredit other publishers or establish the purity of your own project. And as these corporations began looking to zines as places to showcase their products, and as reporters for Newsweek and New York Times began calling up zine publishers, there was this worry that there was no way to not be co-opted by these forces. Like, if you played ball, if you took the American Spirit ad, or if you talked to that reporter, you were tainted by consumerism. Your dissent was in danger of merely becoming rebellion. But since my co-founders and I wanted to grow Bitch, this was weird for us because we defined selling out very differently. So much of what Bitch did was critique advertising and beauty culture and things like that. So we felt that really the only way that we could sell out was to pull our punches in critiquing those things. Or, if we accepted advertising from like L'Oreal, but that wasn't likely to happen. So our bar for selling out was pretty low. If selling out was going to be defined by simply engaging with the mainstream, then we were already losing, because that's exactly what we wanted to do. So sometimes that was something we just kept on the QT around more hardcore zinesters. And that brings us to rebellion question number 3. If the mainstream likes it, can it still be cool? So I was talking about this Kill Zinesters time recently with a friend who was actually on that tour. And he described the scene much like his experience in punk music as a subculture in love with its own underdog status. But in the mid to late 90s, American culture was kind of in love with underdog status. That's kind of how it was. And the themes that made zines resonate with people who considered themselves anti-establishment and anti-mainstream were themselves being co-opted by big business. Advertising in particular glommed onto the idea of slackers and losers as these potential markets. And so they constructed things that were meant to attract the attention of people who in general considered themselves sort of wise to the mainstream sales pitch. So we got ads like Simple Shoes did a lot of advertising that was very sort of, this is what we're doing, we're not trying to fool you, except we are trying to fool you because really we're selling you shoes. And does anyone remember OK Cola? So OK Cola happened. And then eventually this led to stuff like the Sony PSP graffiti campaigns, which actually used graffiti to sort of co-opt the idea of street art as rebellion to sell a product. And these were all very contrived and in some cases really cynical attempts to monetize the alternative. Some were successful and some weren't, and some were kind of both. So Might magazine was this magazine co-founded by a dude named Dave Eggers, who you might know. So Might was a magazine about culture and ideas, and it was sort of interested in the world but loath to be seen taking that world too seriously. So it was, you know, very much a continuation of Spy and a precursor to things like Gawker. But it was ingenious too, because in addition to having really great writing and really talented contributors, it was one of the first media entities to really blur the line between alternative and mainstream, and it did that by being very transparent about the economics of what it took to put a magazine into the world. This was one of its first issues, and it was called Might Sells Out, and every bit of content in it was underwritten by brands. So the ad was this, the cover was this ad for Goldschlager Schnapps, and the editor's page said things like, Dave Eggers appears courtesy of Doers. And you know, it was really brilliant in having it both ways. It was poking fun at the reality of the magazine industry, but also benefiting from that and allowing its sponsors to benefit from it. And it was also sending up the really earnest culture of independent publishing, where ads were, you know, at best seen as this necessary evil. Another interesting thing was happening in the mid-90s during the time when zines were having a moment and Might was walking this line, and you know, grunge had become something you could buy in department stores. Actual mainstream media was becoming more and more consolidated, because in the mid-1990s the FCC started relaxing media ownership rules, which meant that corporations like, say, Rupert Murdoch's could buy up the smaller newspapers and the TV stations and the publishing houses and the film studios like, you know, like a giant Pac-Man, just eating up all these tiny concerns. And so media got more mass and independent media got more endangered. And that brought us to where we are now, where 4 or 5 multinational corporations own and control all of the mass media landscape. None of this was on our minds when we started Bitch. To us, it was this fun project that we hoped would become a bigger thing. We were 3 readers, frustrated readers, writers. We had no juice, we had no connections at mainstream publications. We were doing a zine because we had no more exact or reliable way to get our words and our thoughts out into the world. We wanted to find our fellow dissenters, but as we began learning more and more about what it meant to be a true alternative and not just a marketable alternative, we became sort of publishing activists. We became incredibly invested in making sure that independent magazines were valued and could continue to thrive. And that brings us to rebellion question number 4. For love or money, does it have to be either or? One of the bits of conventional wisdom that was used to define a zine way back when, and I don't remember who coined this, was that a zine was something that you did for love and not money. If that's true, Bitch is still a zine in that key way. You know, we pay our contributors, we have a paid staff, we have the structure of a board of directors and a regular production schedule. We're accountable to all kinds of people and entities, but no one comes to work for Bitch or writes for Bitch because of the money, let's just put it that way. And yet, for love and not money implies that money isn't even a concern. And that's definitely not true for Bitch, because we are constantly thinking about money and strategizing about money and talking about money. So this is interesting because within a lot of alternative spheres, historically money is kind of like the great elephant in the room. Within feminism, there's historically been a dynamic where nobody's supposed to be better than anyone else, no idea is supposed to be worth more than any other. The worst thing you can call another feminist is a careerist, because that implies that they want to be compensated for what they do. And then, you know, in creative fields, there's a third dynamic with money, which many of you are probably familiar with, where people will often expect you to do your work for free because you love it and presumably you do it anyway, so why not? So this has really been crucial for us as an organization that is alternative, that is feminist, that is creative. You know, money is kind of like the invisible duck feet, you know, below the surface of like a pond. And what we do at Bitch in a lot of ways is to try and be transparent about that and to be like, look at our duck feet. You know, we're paddling like hell over here to try and stay afloat, because it doesn't serve us or anyone to pretend that money's not important. It doesn't serve activism, it doesn't serve creativity, it doesn't serve, you know, social movements like feminism. But this wasn't always true of Bitch. And without getting too deep into talking about stressful times in the organization's history, there were definite moments of reckoning where we had to look at whether our stance on like not paying proofreaders or being suspicious of people with MBAs was being true to our ideals or being sort of like pointlessly beholden to them. You know, there are ways that the alternative mindset and the creative mindset can end up with some really toxic byproducts, and Bitch has definitely lived those moments. There was one particular time when we had a publisher who was, you know, just so convinced of the ruinous potential of appearing to care about money that we had to shut down for a while and really consider what it was we were putting out into the world, not just in terms of a product, but in terms of ideology. And so, you know, that can be very difficult. And the conventional wisdom about rebellion, or dissent for that matter, is that eventually money causes you to become the thing that you rebelled or dissented against. That's definitely true of Spy and Might magazines, whose founders went on, you know, they went from lampooning media power players to becoming media power players. You know, Graydon Carter became the editor of Vanity Fair. Kurt Anderson went on to found a startup and be a best-selling author, and you know, we all know what happened to Dave Eggers. But becoming the thing that you once rebelled against is also true. Well, we also see it happening now with like bloggers and tweeters who kind of operate outside the mainstream until they're validated by that mainstream with, you know, a book deal or a production deal or something like that. You know, we see it with street artists whose work eventually ends up on, you know, shopping bags and things like that. And it might happen to feminist magazines. We don't really know. But just a few weeks ago, we got a really nice letter, and it said something like, "It's so nice to see a mainstream feminist website commenting on whatever it was we were commenting on." And we were all really taken aback. Like, is she calling Bitch mainstream? Are we like, we don't have enough money to be mainstream. Like, you know, and that speaks to the way that many of us construct our identities and go on to sort of shape our creative work alongside these identities that are sort of formed by our ideas about what money does or how it operates in these fields. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if Bitch has become mainstream just because we've been around for, you know, 18 years, or because we're established, or because we're old. You know, it's hard to square someone's perception of Bitch in particular as mainstream just because feminism is still such a fringe ideology in a lot of ways. But I do think that there's value in kind of blurring the line between alternative and mainstream spaces, and I think that's happened a lot recently, largely because of the internet. I think it's healthier for cultures to not kind of get bogged down in those orthodoxies, because it is really easy to get stuck there. Rebellion question number 5, can you package dissent? So this quote is from Thomas Frank, who's the founder of the journal The Baffler, and he wrote a 1997 book called Commodify Your Dissent. And the quote is, "The problem with cultural dissent in America isn't that it's been co-opted, absorbed, or ripped off. Of course, it's been all of those things, but it has proven so hopelessly susceptible to such assaults for the same reason it has become so harmless in the first place. It is no longer any different from the official culture it's supposed to be subverting." So, commodify your dissent was really prescient at the time about how American culture fancied itself this underdog fighting the system, and how the underdog had sort of quickly become a capitalist mainstay. And I've been thinking a lot about this question of whether it's possible to package dissent lately, because in the past year there's been a lot of talk, not necessarily within feminism, but kind of adjacent to feminism, about whether feminism needs a rebrand to be more relevant. And there have been at least 2 fairly high-profile contests and challenges to people and to institutions to produce a piece of creative that sort of visually represents feminism and makes it relatable and attractive to a world that's often pretty squirrely about that particular ideology. So this is one of the calls for this contest, and then this is one of the, I don't know if one of the resulting pieces that this was like a collaboration between LUK and I think a design company. Anyway, so the idea of something like a contest to make feminism more relevant is fascinating to me, because people within the movement find it plenty relevant already. The work that they and that we are doing is really connected to very timely, very real world, very pressing issues. But I think, it says a lot that these efforts to rebrand feminism are coming from the spheres of advertising and marketing, and that the word relevance there is sort of code for, palatable and sexy and everything that social movements generally aren't. Within the movement, feminism is a lot stronger and more diverse and less monolithic, I think, than it's ever been. But one thing it's not is sellable, and I don't actually expect that it ever will be sellable. I reviewed this book recently called Wonder Women, I think is the name, and the book was by the president of Barnard College in New York, and the author issued a call for what she called a softer, gentler feminism. And that was just really funny, and of course everyone made fun of it on Twitter because it was like, that's what you want in toilet paper, not in feminism. But it's true. I mean, that's not what you look for in a political or social ideology. It would be really ridiculous if you heard, I don't know, with any other movement that would sound as ridiculous as it is, but with feminism somehow it's acceptable. That's like, that's a worthy goal. And again, this is the difference between rebellion and dissent. If you want to repackage an ideology to sell it to the mainstream, your process invariably involves that mainstream helping to shape your sales pitch. When you're living that ideology, that in itself is the package, but it's just not that easy to sell it to, a vast audience. And that's one of the ongoing struggles of the broader feminist movement. I think you can package feminism as rebellion. It's been done. Like the Spice Girls and Lilith Fair and Virginia Slims and Nike sneakers and the right hand diamond ring, which is a thing, I guess. Miley Cyrus, Bridesmaids, all those used feminism as part of their sales pitch. And that's something that I call marketplace feminism. It's the process of choosing what aspects of the movement are sexiest and most relatable, and then amplifying them, usually to the detriment of other equally important and often more pressing issues. And that's, just something that feminism is probably always going to contend with. So, rebellion question number 7. Has the mainstream become the alternative? And this is where I talk a little bit more about magazines in particular. I recently spoke at an alternative media conference about the endurance of print media. And in preparing for that, I asked people on Facebook and Twitter why they love print media. But almost without thinking, the way I phrased the question was, why do you still love print media? Which is so reflective of the way we often talk about print, like it's this quaint holdover from another time rather than something that is still, a multi-billion-dollar industry. But anyway, these were some of the reasons. It's tangible. A lot of people talked about smell. It smells good. It's portable. It's easily archivable. It offers a sense of separation of personal time from work time, and it's private. Very few of us have opportunities these days to not be sort of marketed to via our activities online. So a lot of people are getting more interested in the experience of print where nothing is harvested. This is one of a series of ads that ran in mainstream magazines starting in 2010. 5 major magazine companies joined up with the Magazine Publishers of America, and they created this campaign called Magazines, the Power of Print. And the campaign was targeted much more toward advertisers than readers, but it made a really crucial point that what looks in any medium like reading might actually be a very different behavior. And what I mean by that is that the internet is immersive in a very acquisitive way. There's a sense of constant forward motion that's made even urgent when you're reading things that have links and comments. You're consuming it very literally. You're like, what am I getting out of this article or blog post? How can I make use of it? Am I going to tweet it? Should I send it as a link to my friend or my mom? What did the 300 people who commented on it have to say? Do I agree with them? Why does this person think my comment is stupid? I think their comment is stupid. It's like it's almost not enough to read something simply for the sake of reading. So print, in some ways, becomes a respite from that. When you sit down with a book or a magazine, there are no inbuilt expectations for that experience. You don't need to share it. If you're, to contrast with an e-reader, you don't necessarily have to go into like the hyperdata or the links or whatever you kids are calling those things. I don't know. Anyway. But you don't feel compelled to immediately react, and that is becoming like a less and less common experience, and so for the people who seek it out, it's really valuable. It is kind of fascinating to me that these days print magazines, in a way, have become the alternative, while, simultaneously, these once kind of underground zines have become very much a part of the academy, largely because of the movement to archive them. So, the phenomenon of zine archiving is still growing, but the fact that, the biggest zine archives in America are in institutions like NYU and Barnard and Duke University, which is where Bitch's archives are housed, is kind of it's kind of interesting. It's taken them from this really underground thing to this kind of elite alternative. And that's sort of true of print publishing now. It is definitely a different kind of alternative. If you're launching a print magazine right now, people are going to be like, why? Because it does seem like this prohibitively expensive thing, this labor-intensive thing, this thing that you probably don't really need to do because there are so many more accessible options. But doing it puts you in line with this certain kind of publishing. And that's kind of borne out by looking at the magazines that have launched in the past decade. Art and shelter magazines, and foodie magazines, and magazines of like intellectual discourse and ideas. This is the Library of the Printed Web, which is a publication that was actually founded by Bitch's founding art director. And it's a publication that literally prints out things from the web and puts them in publication form. Then there's stuff like Wrap Magazine, which features design and illustration in removable spreads that you can use as wrapping paper or frame as art objects. So yeah, magazines have become, the subject matter is very, it's very tailored to this specific kind of niche lifestyle moments. And in a lot of ways, the magazine industry seems to be taking a lot of cues from food culture. You know, they're small batch, they're artisanal, and you know, it's interesting. Like, it sounds a little pretentious, but you know, I think the most beautiful and in a lot of ways the most intriguing magazines don't want to be mass media anymore. They want to be micromedia. You know, they want to be this small thing that a certain number of people love, but really love hard enough to keep it in business. That's kind of like having one foot in the zine tradition of, you know, really embracing a single subject and geeking out on it and not trying to be all things to all readers. And then there's also this element to them of, you know, an art object, something that's not meant to be disposable the way you know, would recycle a magazine that comes out weekly or something like that. Anyway. Final rebellion question. Does rebelling against the past mean killing it off? Because Bitch was founded in the San Francisco Bay Area in the mid-90s, we've lived through 2 iterations of the end of print evangelizing. First in the late 1990s, and then later when the 2008 recession started tanking long-running magazines. And as someone who really loves print and wants to support it in all its forms, I'm very passionate about debunking the idea that media is a zero-sum proposition. Like I said before, the idea that, you know, you don't have to phrase it like, why do you still love print? It doesn't have to be that way. There has always been this fear that new medias, whatever they might be, would kill off pre-existing medias. And it hasn't always been that simple. You know, in the 1960s, everyone was really, really worried because they thought television's popularity was going to be the death of the consumer print magazine. And in fact, it inspired those magazines to not compete with television and to create this more immersive kind of reading experience, and that's what gave rise to new journalism. You know, likewise, CDs and music streaming didn't kill vinyl records. I mean, they kind of, you know, they maimed them for a while, but then they made them into this connoisseur's medium, which things like Record Store Day have now really brought back to the point where, you know, more bands are producing records on vinyl. And the internet and e-readers have not killed magazines, but they are turning them into, again, a connoisseur's medium, this micromedia niche publishing that are serving perfectly a smaller number of people who want just that thing. We did a podcast last year on the subject of words we hate. And the word I talked about hating is long reads, which has cropped up. Do you all know what long reads means? So it's cropped up in the past couple of years to refer to a piece of writing on the internet that, were it in print form, we would just call like an article or an essay. And it took me a really long time to figure out why I hate that word, but I figured it out. It's because, you know, I've witnessed, as we all have probably, the struggle to sort of legitimize writing online or not in print as, you know, a legit thing. So long read to me by saying like, whoa, this piece is over 1,500 words, pack a lunch, you're gonna be here for a while. Like, that's, to me, that really undermines, you know, the legitimacy of writing on the internet, which is, you know, not that different from writing off the internet. So it's normalizing this kind of bite-sized, you know, short attention span writing. And I'm talking about long reads in order to sort of point out that we're still really in a place of flux when it comes to print and digital media. You know, we want writing on the internet to be as legitimate as writing not on the internet, but then we other it with terms like long read. And these things are all part of that zero-sum mentality of print versus digital, and the idea that one medium is necessarily going to cancel out the other. And that doesn't really have to be the case. Yeah. So I think the valuable thing about the best print media, you know, both past and present, is that every decision that goes into it, from the typeface to the cover art to the copy editing to the little folios on the bottom, seems really considered. And that's how it should be. That care should be reflected in the final project, in the final product of whatever it is and however you're going to read it. But as a print reader, I have seen how very easy it is for standards to go downhill when you stop valuing that stuff in one medium. And in magazines, you know, I see all those things going downhill, like so many more errors and factual errors and just, you know, sort of really simple boneheaded mistakes that shouldn't be made in any medium. And companies are investing in tech, which is great, but often they're doing so at the cost of content and making sure that content is good and reads well and is not full of mistakes. And this goes back to the money thing, you know, the idea that if the work you do is creative, it is somehow considered less valuable than the work of, you know, infrastructure and data and information architecture and things like that. You know, the future of any publishing, print or not, being successful really depends on valuing all the work. I think for the past decade or more, there's been this idea that tech is kind of the cowboy thing that is gonna save us all by rebelling against the staid old world of print. But tech is now the mainstream, like that's pretty obvious. I think there's a way to work with that and respect it, and then move print forward as well, and sort of move everything forward, and not think of it as either or, but think of it as both and. You know, I would love to see a canon of magazines the way we have canons of books that we look to and we honor, and we think about our past while we're creating our present, even if, you know, we're not looking at the canon of magazines to create more magazines, but to create different kinds of reading and media experiences. At Bitch, we've kind of struggled with more than one death narrative. I mean, besides the whole death of print thing, we also contend with this perennial notion that feminism is dead. And that's a whole other subject for a talk, but I have found it interesting the way that some people really seem to get invested in the idea of movements or mediums dying. And I guess the most charitable way I can think about explaining it is that it's just this kind of failure of imagination. You know, it's this inability to believe that something can evolve to be profoundly different from what it once was and still remain relevant and meaningful. And you know, I think instead of thinking of print as something that we're going to lose to, you know, the big giant octopus-like tentacles of technology, I think it's important to think of all the ways that they can complement one another and be together and work together to honor, you know, both a shared past and whatever they are going forward. So that's actually all I have to say. All right, thank you so much.